we will go over to questions. And Christine and I have a mic here, and Sarah has a roving mic. So if you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand and Sarah will bring the mic over to you. Who'd like to start? Please don't be shy. Yes, Chris.
Thank you very much for your paper. Question about 1 Corinthians 7. I think, if I remember rightly, you suggested that the teaching of Jesus there, which is explicitly relied on, is subverted by the Christ event. What would you then make of the distinction that takes place in the text between I now speak and now this is the Lord and not I? And how does that function in that particular chapter, and how does that relate to your own thesis?
Thank you for this interesting question. I think particularly this passage shows the principles of Paul's use of Jesus tradition in general, because it comes up as a question from the Corinthian community, how to deal with married women and men who get divorced. And he knows this Jesus tradition and takes it up and processes it. But if you look at the context of this passage, you will find, for instance, in 1 Corinthians 6, that he prefers a model of life that is dedicated to Christ, because our body is a member of Christ's body. And he himself prefers to live ascetically. And this is what he actually, I think, wants to have, that all Christians do that. But there is this Jesus tradition, and I would say that it in fact shows some elements that Paul knew more about this tradition. This parenthesis, in verse 11, has a link to the synoptic passage, to synoptic parallel. So he brings it in his letter. He quotes it, in fact. But nevertheless, he wants to say that it is actually better to stay without marriage, not to have a man or a woman, but to live ascetic. So, to sum up, it's a tradition that he knows, but he doesn't put this tradition into the highest hierarchy, so to speak. He does not put it on the top of his argumentation, but it has a special status. It's not, as far as the content is concerned, it is not that important to Paul.
I just want to add two small points to that passage. First, in my view, it is important that Paul is quoting here saying of the Lord, not of Jesus, but of the Lord. So that means for Paul it is only important because it is a saying of the risen Lord. When Paul quotes or refers to Jesus as the Lord, then obviously he means Jesus as the exalted one. So the saying is important because it's a saying of the exalted Jesus, not the earthly Jesus who walked through Galilee and whatever. And the second point is, Paul can develop in that passage his own views on related matters with the same authority. And he can speak in his own voice and in his own authority that is on the same level as the saying of the Lord. That becomes quite clear at the end of the chapter when he says that I have the Spirit of the Lord. So I have the pneuma. And that means that Paul speaks as an apostle in its own authority, and that authority Paul does not make a distinction between his own authority and that saying of the Lord that he quotes in that passage. So, and therefore he can also refer in 1 Corinthians 14, this passage that was quoted by Christine, that what I'm telling you is a commandment of the Lord. So, and that's very important for Paul, that he does not refer to sayings or episodes of the earthly Jesus, but that what Jesus said is important because he is now the exalted Lord, who has authorized Paul himself, and therefore Paul can speak in the authority of the Lord. And that's, I think, quite important for an interpretation of 1 Corinthians 7.
But then why distinguish between his...
Because he knows that there was a Jesus saying about divorce.
This is just my point. He distinguishes it in this case because he is not... He does not stand behind the content of it. He usually speaks in the Lord, in the authority of the risen Lord, and then there's no need to distinguish his own authority from the risen Lord. But in this case, he has a different opinion. He is not a proponent of marriage. So in this case, he knows a special and particular tradition of the Lord concerning marriage and marital status. And then, in this case, he says, this is what the Lord says. It's indeed an interesting passage because he starts formulating it with the words Pangelo, uk ego, alla ho kyrios. So he really makes a very clear distinction in this case.
Thanks again for this wonderful paper. I really enjoyed listening to it. And you know, we agree in many points, especially to see the letters of Paul as a vehicle for Jesus tradition by their own. But I'd like to follow up this 1 Corinthian topic and to widen it a bit more to the whole letter of 1 Corinthians. Don't you think there's a difference between 1 Corinthians to the other letters of Paul? It's not only 7, 9, 11, it's also the manner in which Paul refers to Jesus. I think there is a difference, and do you have any explanation why this 1 Corinthians is different to the other letters?
Thank you for the question. It is indeed remarkable that in 1 Corinthians we find almost every passages of Jesus tradition that there are in general in the Pauline letters. They all come up in this one letter. Can I switch to German? I hope you understand then probably better what I say, even if you are not a native speaker of German, than my English. Dieser Brief ist eben hoch argumentativ und setzt sich sozusagen mit vielen an Paulus herangetragenen Problemen und Fragen der Gemeinde auseinander. Und es kam auch in der Forschung immer wieder die These auf, dass aus diesem Grund Paulus Jesus-Tradition auch deswegen heranzieht, weil er damit natürlich eine weitere Autorität verwenden kann, um seine Position durchzusetzen. Ich glaube, dass es, weil es eben gerade auch in dem Brief daneben einige Passagen gibt, wie 1. Korinther 14,37, wo Paulus in der Autorität des Kyrios spricht, ohne klar zu unterscheiden zwischen einem erhöhten Kyrios und sich selbst, dass sozusagen das Konzept einer übereinstimmenden Autorität des Kyrios mit Paulus auch diesem Brief zugrunde liegt und die Besonderheiten hier darin liegen, dass Paulus bei Einzelfällen, die an ihn herangetragen werden, tatsächlich Überlieferungen kennt die er dem erhöhten Kyrios zuschreibt und die er dann eben mit der Autorität des Erhöhten.
Yeah, I heard you mention that only aspects relevant to Paul's communities are preserved in the letters. And you also mentioned Dale Allison. I recently read Constructing Jesus' chapter 5 on death and memory, where he argues, forcibly I think, that Paul knew passion narrative. He presents various points of contact between that and the synoptic tradition of the passion narrative, I think, the Markan narrative especially. Could you share reflections on that, the presence of Jesus' tradition in that way?
I think that the Jesus story that I read out, as Alexander Wedderburn has narrated it, that there's not much more behind in the Pauline letters. Not really a bigger passion narrative. The only indication or evidence for more knowledge of passion narrative would be 1 Corinthians 11, 23 to 25, in fact. On the night he was betrayed, you know, this passage. But I don't think that there's much more behind. At least we cannot find more, or Paul does not make more of this Jesus story. Perhaps this interpretation of Jesus' death and passion that we find in the understanding of Paul of his apostleship. This could be an evidence that he knew a passion narrative or more about the circumstances of Jesus' death, because he draws himself as somebody who suffers in a particular theological sense of the word. But I don't think there's anything more to be find more particularly, more events or whatever within this passion narrative.
All right, thank you.
Thinking in the context of cultural memory and the phrase of Paul saying that he is in reception of a tradition which he wishes to pass on to the people listening to him or reading him, I was wondering if you could tell us anything about what you might think of a link between any cultural memory that Paul may have received in light of what we may know from Jan Assmann and so on, as against the very clear idea of him speaking on behalf of the Lord, of the Kyrios. So is there a distinction between a specific Christian identity which he sees coming through from what he's learned as a Jew, of his fellow Jew, Jesus, and what he has actually received in his experience of having been hitherto a persecutor of the Christian church, as being a kind of maybe multifaceted interpretation of the Christian experience coming from culture?
I don't know if I got you right. Do you want to know about the connection between what Paul learned about the Jesus story from other communities and his own experience of the risen Christ?
Indeed. It may be something that is not actually possible for us to access, but I wonder if there's any evidence where there may be a distinction between his own ideas, which he has come through cultural memory, as against what he might perceive as being a direct communication with the risen Lord.
Yes, this is an important question. I think he, in fact, received certain elements of this Christ event from Antiochia, from this community, but his own experience of seeing the risen Christ was a kind of innovative impulse that made him think about what he received in a special way. And he can use technical terms for tradition, like in 1 Corinthians 15 and 11, paralambanein and paradidonai. In these cases, he refers to tradition that was handed down to him from the communities. In other cases, he has this language of I am persuaded in the Lord. And I think in these cases, it could be that he refers to his own experience near Damascus. But I think one cannot distinguish it that way, not clearly.
Yes, thank you. I had a question having to do with your comments on Pauline Parnassus. Romans 12, while you're going through that, I was thinking of works by Carl Wilhelm Niebuhr and Walter Wilson from memory on Jewish, Hellenistic Jewish Parnassus. And they argue, if I recollect correctly, that underneath Hellenistic Jewish Parnassus, such as pseudo-faculties and so forth, even Ben Sira, there is a base tradition, which is the Torah. But the whole point is to render the Torah tradition into sapiential language, into wisdom language, in a way which is completely sapientialized. This then allows wider connections into the wider cosmopolitan wisdom tradition and Greek Paranatic tradition. I wondered if you consider that as a model for what Paul might be up to. In fact, there is some kind of Dominical Paranatic tradition on analogy with the Torah. Perhaps it's a bad analogy, but where there's actually a program of trying to render that into sapiential language. I don't know if that's, if you get my drift or not, but.
So your question is about whether the way Ben Sira had was Jewish tradition is a model.
Yeah, I mean, but if I recall correctly, what Niebuhr and Wilson argues that underneath Hellenistic Jewish wisdom, sapiential works like Ben Sira, like pseudo-faculties and so forth, their Torah is the base tradition, but they're not quoting Torah directly. It's in sapiential language. You can actually find, but you can't understand it without reference to the Torah. I just wonder if that might be a model for what Paul might be up to as well with the Jesus tradition in his Paranatic sections.
Yes, I think that makes good sense, very good sense. Maybe it also goes into this direction of the question before. What were the models of Paul's innovative use of older tradition? It's indeed interesting to look how he innovates certain traditions, and maybe this is a good model. In fact, one should look further on how that works, indeed.
But that would not mean, I think, in your opinion, that Paul is referring here to Jesus' teaching without mentioning Jesus. So I think that was the point of Carl Wilhelm Niebuhr, that there's a tradition in Judaism to teach on the basis of the Torah without mentioning the Torah, and that could be the case here with Paul as well, so that he is referring to Jesus' teachings without mentioning Jesus himself. So, but I think that is absolutely not necessary to explain this passage. So no one would come up with the idea that it is a teaching of Jesus on the basis of Romans 12. So that is completely, you can explain that passage completely by referring to Jewish Hellenistic traditions. So that is not necessary to refer to a teaching of Jesus here.
No, I understood it differently. Maybe I just had another. Maybe I had another idea. I don't know this book from Niebuhr. So, what came into my mind is that Paul uses this sapiential way of processing tradition, conventional motives, and so on. This way of innovating older motives and themes. But as I wanted to show it, his interpretation, orientation, so to speak, is the Christ event. And the bases are not Jesus words, in most cases at least, but ethics, Jewish wisdom, also in Romans 12, I think this is the case.
Behind you. He was first, I'm afraid.
Sorry, Anthony. Just to continue this, though, so what we have in Romans 2 and 1 Peter 3 is identity formation for the new Christian communities, then the very structure of argument will be to derive the greatest amount of dissimilarity from the tradition that's coming from. So increase in meta-contrast ratio, if you like, if you enjoy social identity theories lately. So in that case, it would, even though there is a broader tradition to go back to, such as Ben Sari does with the Torah, etc., it would make argumentative sense for identity formation for these communities that Paul would be referring to Jesus' tradition rather than to Jewish tradition interpreted through the Christ event, because one is salient to their own community, and the other is an extra level of redaction further back. So if these are identity formation devices, then surely it would be the case that you'd be going for a closer, more salient identity former in the Christ, in the Jesus narrative, etc.
May I just put a question to you? From where would the Romans know that Paul is referring here to Jesus?
I don't. Given that the letters of Romans seems to imply a fair degree of both Jewish and Jesus knowledge, I'd say yes, and certainly the Petrine letters do.
What? And certainly the Petrine letters do as well.
But if you take it seriously that Paul is writing a letter to the Roman churches that consist of Jews and Gentiles, and when it is, in my view, very hypothetical to assume that Paul thinks that they know about Jesus traditions that Matthew and Luke have collected in the Sermon on the Mount.
We are getting into the realm of hypothetical here quite considerably, but if we are going down the hypothetical, then the salient identity formation device for a Christian community over and above a Jewish Torah or a Jewish sapiential tradition will be through the lens of the Jesus memories, especially given the rhetoric earlier on in Romans regarding Jewishness.
The difficulty, I think, hence is identifying, is that it's very difficult to find evidence.
Oh, of course, yeah. But from the general argumentative model.
Yeah. Folks, our time has gone. Sorry? Oh, go on. I'm sorry, Joan, our time really has gone. Folks, our time has gone. We'll be hearing